It was in the summer of 1958, somewhere along a remote stretch of road winding through the Great Smoky Mountains, that my motorcycle gave out just as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Not the kind of gentle summer rain that brings relief after a hot day, but the kind that rolls in like a wall, sudden and angry, drenching everything in its path, as if the sky itself had been holding some. I'd think back for too long and finally decided to let go. I remember pulling off to the side of the road, the engine sputtering its last breath, the air thick with the scent of pine and ozone, and realizing I was miles from the nearest town, with nothing but my leather jacket, a small duffel strapped to the back seat, and a folded letter tucked in the inside pocket. A letter I had written more than a decade earlier, during my recovery in a VA hospital. A letter addressed to a woman I had once promised to love forever, but never sent. I had been headed to a reunion of veterans down in Knoxville, one of those gatherings where old soldiers shake hands a little longer than necessary, and the silences between words say more than any toast ever could. I hadn't planned on stopping, hadn't planned on remembering her. Not in that way, but as the rain started to fall harder, drumming on my helmet and fogging my visor, something in the wind shifted, like the past itself was trying to catch up with me, and suddenly I wasn't just a man riding to see old friends. I was a man carrying something unfinished. The storm was quick to swallow the sky, and I found myself pushing the bike along the wet shoulder of the road, boots sinking into the soft mud, thunder rolling low and constant, like a distant artillery memory I hadn't asked to relive. And just when I began to think I might have to sleep under a tree or worse, I saw a dim light flickering between the trees. A porch light, faint and golden, the kind you only see out in the country, where people still trust that someone lost might need shelter. The cabin was small, wooden, with its boards weathered by seasons and solitude, but the porch was swept clean, and the curtains inside were drawn. Not tightly, but softly, as if whoever lived there had nothing to hide. I climbed the steps, boots squelching, and knocked on the screen door, water dripping from the brim of my helmet, heart pounding in a way I hadn't felt since the war. Not from fear, but from something harder to name, something like fate catching its breath. And when the door opened, when she appeared there, framed in the warm light of a single lamp, her hair pulled back, her eyes widening in disbelief, I knew immediately that it was her, Emily, the woman I had met in 1943, the woman I had kissed beneath a Carolina sky and left with a blue ribbon in my hand and a promise on my lips. The woman I had searched for in every letter that never arrived, in every face I passed on the street, in every silence between the lines of the newspapers I read after the war. And there she was, older, of course, changed by life in the ways we all are, but still her. Still the same soul I had once carried with me across oceans and battlefields and years of not knowing. And I, the man who thought he had buried the past for good, stood on her porch, dripping wet and speechless, with only that old letter and the weight of everything unsaid between us. If this story is already touching something deep in you, the way it did for me while writing it, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing true stories that move, inspire, and stay with you long after they end. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. I met Emily in 1943 in a small farming community just outside Asheville, North Carolina, at a time when the war felt distant in headlines but ever present in the hearts of young men and women, when nights smelled of honeysuckle and sweat, and every sunrise brought a question: will this be the day someone writes that you're gone? She was 18, with eyes like early summer skies, bright and fearless, though I later would learn that courage sometimes hides behind quiet tears. And I was 19, just drafted, carrying in my pack a letter from home, and in my heart an idea that love might be the one thing war could never touch or erase. Her father, Dr. Henderson, was the kind of country doctor who made house calls, patched up children falling from barns, delivered babies by moonlight, stitched wounds inflicted by farm equipment and later by grief when soldiers returned disfigured or never returned at all. And she, Emily, helped him by fetching clean bandages late into the night, by holding lamp for him when he sewed together skin and flesh, by offering water with trembling hands to a man who did not recognize his own wife anymore. In those moments, I watched her, saw the way she moved, gentle but steady, how she offered a smile to the broken, a soft word to the sorrowed, and something inside me shifted, as though I realized that if love was a shelter, she was its roof. She was the beam that held everything upright. We fell in love in moments stolen between dusk and dawn. I would meet her by the creek that ran behind her family's barn, its water cool and clear, the air heavy with fireflies, and we'd talk of what we hoped for after the war. School, maybe children, a small house with a porch swing and nights lit by starlight, not flares, nights when the only thing we needed to fear was frost in early spring or drought in summer. She braided a ribbon of blue into my hair, a ribbon she said would remind me of her when the nights got cold and the world felt far away. I promised her I would return, that I would write letters every month, that distance and time would not dim what was in my heart, that I would carry her memory like a torch until I came back. Then in 1944, I shipped overseas across the Atlantic to places I had only seen in maps. Normandy, the hedgerows, the roar of artillery, the smell of wet earth turned to mud by boots and rain, the way nights were broken by alarms instead of crickets, and letters I sent to Emily were full of longing. I described the color of the sunrise over the fields in France, the smell of bread baking in town kitchens when bombs were far enough away, the way I missed the quiet of Asheville, the soft churches, her laughter, and I tucked memories into every line. I believed with all I had that those letters would reach her, that she would know I was alive, that I had not forgotten. But the letters stopped coming back with replies. Sometimes they came back undelivered, marked with foreign stamps and red ink, or simply were never collected or lost in the shuffle of displaced people. Postal delays, military censors who cut words like they were weeds, refusing to let certain truths pass. I heard rumors that her hometown had been hit by flooding, that roads had washed out, that many families lost their homes, that some letters had drowned in torn-open bags, that others had been burned in barns threatened by wildfires in drought, or burned by accident or fear. I worried deeply that she might believe I was gone, that silence might have convinced her I would fail to return, that she might have moved on, married, left the past buried, while I kept carrying her in my heart like a secret no one else could know. After the war ended, when I returned to the US, wounded in body and soul, I found work rebuilding railroad tracks, helping in construction, anything that made me feel I was part of something again, though every job reminded me of what I had lost, the weight of an axe, the sound of hammers, the smell of sawdust and sweat, all of them echoes of exhaustion and hope intertwined. I searched for her address, for people who might remember her. I wrote letters to her family, to old neighbors, to folks who might have known Dr. Henderson, but nobody could tell me what had become of her, whether she had waited, whether she had tried to find me, whether she believed I was alive. I still held the ribbon she gave me, folded into a small wooden box I carried in my duffel bag, kept it safe, kept it hidden from those who asked, "Who are you still holding on to? Why do you show your scars every time you see the ribbon?" But I could never say that it represented more than memory, that it was more than love. It was the tether between what had been and what might still be. And I slept with the fear that love might slip away in silence, that what I remembered might become imaginary. Because without her voice in reply, without a hand reaching back, memory fears it's betraying itself. Days passed into weeks, weeks into months. I visited the postal office in Asheville, asked after old names, old addresses. I visited the Henderson home once, years after returning, but found it empty, overgrown, paint peeling, windows shuttered, the barn sagging, the porch swing gone. And I wondered whether love survives when the places that bore it are gone. I collected old letters people wrote, diaries, local newspapers recounting who left town, who passed away. But Emily's name did not appear except in my own memory, which was both blessing and burden, because memory keeps alive what reality might have already buried. All the while I carried guilt. Guilt for not writing more often. Guilt for surviving battles when so many did not. Guilt for believing sometimes that maybe it would be easier if I forgot. Because remembering felt like having an ache in the chest that never healed, like being awake every night, wondering if she thought I was dead. And yet love held me together, even when the world around me was pulling us apart, even when silence threatened to swallow me, even when voices said, "Move on." She must have moved on. But in my private hours, under low lamplight, I would pull out the ribbon, touch it, smell it, fold it back, whisper Emily's name, and feel, though I could not see, that she remained part of me, undiminished, a remiss in flesh and memory, waiting for the day when fate might allow two broken people to find each other again. I remember the sky breaking over the Smokies as though something enormous had cracked open. Thunder rolling low in the distance, the kind of rumble that seems to vibrate in your bones, and rain coming in waves so hard that every drop felt like it had purpose, like it had been rehearsed by the heavens. And I, aboard my old Harley, felt that purpose crash down upon me, the engine sputtering, water pooling in the kickstand, tires skidding across the slick pavement, and I knew I was caught in a storm that would force me to stop. So I limped along winding roads, boots soaked, leather jacket heavy, heart heavy, each breath tasting of wet asphalt and pine needles, until finally I saw a flicker of light through a curtain of rain, a small cabin, amber glow in window panes, smoke drifting from a knee promising shelter. I dragged the bike up a small slope, pushing past branches weighted with rain, and reached the porch. The boards were slick. I slipped once, caught myself, looked up at the door, at that dim rectangle of safety, and knocked, my knuckles loud in the quiet desperation of the moment. Rain pounding on roof overhead, my shirt clinging to my back, my gloves drenched. The door cracked open, and there she stood, Emily, bathed in soft lamplight, hair pinned back, grey threads in it that caught the glow. Her dress simple, hands halfway raised as though to question who I might be. Eyes wide, heart pounding noticeably in her throat, because I could see the pulse in her neck, the quick breath she took, and for a moment time held still. She did not recognize me immediately. 15 years make shapes of people, wear them down, polish some parts, hide others, change eyes slightly, change voice, change posture. But when I removed my helmet, shivered under its weight of water and memory, and whispered her name, Emily, the change was electric. Something in her face shifted. Recognition came suddenly, like a door that had been locked all those years finally clicked open. She stepped back, hand to mouth, as though she were seeing a ghost or a memory come to life, and I, speechless, drenched, standing with only that old letter inside my jacket, felt all the years crawl back toward me. She let me in. The cabin's interior smelled like warmth. Wood smoke, damp pine, fresh bread, lavender from a windowsill plant, soft rug underfoot, worn chairs, family photos in frames. It was simple, lived in, cozy in that southern way. Quilts folded over the back of a couch, a cast-iron stove in the corner, a small table set for two with chipped china. She rubbed her hands over her arms, where the heat met the chill of coming in from the storm, and she pointed to a chair near the stove. I removed my boots, dripping, coat slung over a chair, trying to let the warmth seep into my bones, trying to let the sight of her, real and here, do the same for my heart. We spoke then, awkwardly at first. I asked if she had married. She said yes, shortly after the war, to a kind man from town who had helped rebuild roads, helped families whose homes were damaged, who tried to make something whole from broken lives. He died in 1950, she told me, leaving her with a little girl, now grown. She paused, eyes downcast, voice low, and then she said, "But I never took you from my memory." Those words hit me like thunder, louder than the storm outside, because they meant everything. She had kept me alive in her thoughts, carried me in her heart across years of silence, across letters never answered, across nights when she must have wondered whether I was gone. I showed her the letter I never sent. It was yellowed, worn, folded many times, the ink smudged in places where I must have written it in fever or by flashlight, thinking every word mattered. How sorry I was, how every day I thought of her, how I believed she would wait. She unfolded it, her hands trembling, read it under the lamp's soft glow, the words I had thought to myself in the hospital ward. If I survive this war, I will come home to you. If I never make it back, know that loving you was one of the few certainties I ever held. She paused, the fold of paper in her lap, eyes shining with tears, and I saw in her expression not reproach but sorrow, love, a kind of mercy I didn't know I needed. She showed me then treasures I thought lost. A porcelain teacup I had given her, cracked but carefully mended, a photograph of us at a summer fair in Asheville, she wearing a sundress, smiling, me holding her hand, both young and hopeful, the sky behind us clear. Those were the days I carried in memory, recreated in nightmares, and often thought were gone forever. That photograph she kept all those years, she said, tucked inside a book of poetry, underlined lines about waiting and longing. We talked long into the evening. Rain pounded the roof, coals glowed in the stove, shadows danced on the walls. She told me how she worked at the town clinic, how she raised her daughter alone, how she watched letters addressed to Peter Asheville pile up in the post office, unclaimed or returned. How many nights she lay awake listening for the wind, hoping I might be on horseback or train, or hitching a ride somewhere distant, arriving at her door. How she considered letting go, how some days she believed I would never come, but something inside her always refused to stop believing. I told her about the front, about nights in Normandy, cold and endless, about how I rewrote my hopes for home in every lull, about how I carried her ribbon in my pocket, how I would finger its worn edge, smell the fabric, imagining you're here, imagining your smile, imagining your voice calling out my name across empty fields. As dawn broke the next morning, rain faded, the mountains visible in faint grey silhouette, we sat outside on the porch, wrapped in quilts, sipping coffee, listening to birds warbling again, to water dripping from eaves, to the world waking. I asked her quietly, "Do you still love me?" My voice was raw, strained by years without hearing her name. She looked at me, tears in her eyes that were not of regret, but of something softer. Acceptance, perhaps relief, always, she said, but now, in a different way. And I saw that this love had survived, not because it stayed unchanged, but because it changed with us, shaped by our losses, softened by our longing, refined by the passage of time. In those few hours, we recognized what remained between us. Not the promise of the future we once spoke of, not the certainty of the life we thought we would build, but the truth of two hearts that had never stopped hoping, never stopped remembering, never stopped carrying love like a flame through darkness. And though the storm had brought me to that door, though the reunion was neither triumphant nor perfect, it was nothing short of miracle. A second chance to touch something pure, something that had belonged to me all along, her presence, her voice, her forgiveness, her memory. There came a quiet evening after that reunion, when the storm had passed. The sky cleared to reveal stars so sharp they seemed to burn away the memory of rain. And I was seated beside Emily in her living room, the firelight making dancing shapes on the walls, while outside the wind whispered through pine needles and the scent of wet earth lingered at the door. And in that moment I asked her gentle, in words barely louder than a breath, "Did you ever write to me after the war ended?" Her eyes, caught by the glow of the lamp, flickered with pain, recognition, and something like regret, and she nodded, her hand moving to smooth the edge of her skirt, as though touched by a memory that was both tender and sharp. She told me she did write, faithfully, for years, every few months, addressed to Asheville, to wherever she believed I might be, sometimes through the VA hospital, sometimes carelessly addressed in tender hope, sometimes to addresses I had once given, sometimes to old friends who might know where I was. She kept stamps, bought envelopes, licked seals in the heavy summer heat, folding each letter with care, pressing her hopes into each line, about how the barn looked after the war, about her daughter's laugh, about how the creak in her front porch swing reminded her of me, about how each sunrise she looked east, hoping one morning I would walk up that driveway once more. She told me that for a time she heard nothing, no replies, no returned letters, until one day, months after the last warships had docked, she began to receive letters back, not mine, but hers, returned undelivered, stamped, "Return to sender." No such address unknown, or sometimes just marked "refuse." She said each returned envelope felt like a shutter closing on a window she had opened, a whisper dying on her lips. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest when I heard that, as though something inside me broke with every returned envelope, every address unknown. I imagined her, opening the mailbox each day with a hopeful breath. I imagined the weight, the heart's readiness, becoming something like ache. I remembered the ribbon she braided in my hair and how I carried it always, in pack, in pocket, in memory, because it was proof that my love was not alone, that someone somewhere believed in me enough to stay. And then I admitted to her I had never sent a particular letter, the one I wrote while in the VA hospital after I came home from overseas, wounded and feverish, because I did not believe it could reach her safely. Because every time I tried to send it, I wondered if it would arrive or if it would be lost, or if she would see in my words a regret so heavy she would be hurt rather than comforted. So I tucked it in a drawer, folded in old clothes, and over the years I kept it, carried it like a secret, as though by holding it I held onto the possibility of reconciliation, of confession, of some truth. One evening I pulled it out, brittle now, the paper yellowed, the creases deep, ink faint in some places from moisture or the acidic air in old drawers, and I gave it to her. She took it, hands trembling, unfolded the sides, eyes wide, voice catching as she read in dim light by the lamp, lighting fragile shadows on her face. I could see each line making its passage through memory. She paused where I had written of nightmares, where I had confessed shame, where I had promised a home, and then read the sentences about how I believed she might have moved on, that silence might have been her way of letting go, that I may have already failed her. When she read the final lines, where I said, "If ever I come back, I will come to your door, ribbon in my hand, heart full of what I never lost," she closed the paper, folded it carefully, tears in her eyes, but not tears of anger. She said, "You kept it all this time?" And I nodded, unable yet to speak because my throat was full of memory, my voice fragile as old cloth. Then she did something I did not expect. She retrieved a small wooden box from a shelf, one she said her mother gave her, filled with keepsakes, loose photos, pressed flowers, ticket stubs, torn pages of books, and inside, tucked beneath old poems, a photograph taken at the county fair in Asheville of us together, me holding her hand under string lights, both of us smiling but with shadows in the background, the world already shifting. And next to it, carefully wrapped in wax paper, a ribbon, blue, faded at its edges, frayed in parts but unmistakably hers. She said she couldn't throw it away, even though many told her to move on, even though her doctor told her holding on would make hurts sharper, even though nights alone made her believe she had dreamed of me so often she might have to stop dreaming to stop the pain. But she kept it, held it close, sometimes touched it as though it still pulsed with life, as though by touching that ribbon she touched the memory of us. The promise we once made under moonlight, behind barns, in the light of summer skies. We sat in silence after that, for what felt like hours, listening to the fire crackle, rain tapping at windows again, though now gentle, as though nature itself had softened. I thought of all the letters she sent, all the letters I never sent, all the promises unspoken, all the months of waiting, of hearing nothing and yet believing. I thought of how war had stolen so many things, lives, innocence, futures, but had not stolen hope. Hope had remained, stubborn as earth, as ribbon, as memory. I told her then, in a voice nearly too soft to hear outside that room, that every night I had lain awake thinking of her. Her laugh, the way she brushed a stray hair from her face, the smell of honeysuckle in her garden, the way shadows lay long on her porch in the evening. I told her that I carried her memory as though it were oxygen, that without it I might have suffocated in the silence. She responded with a whisper. I never believed I'd see you again, but I never stopped believing you existed somewhere. And in that moment her words became whole in my heart, as though the absence of her had been a wound, but hearing her believe in me again was a kind of healing. We laughed too, sometimes softly, sometimes through tears, at memories remembered badly, at silly youthful promises made in moonlight, at songs we once danced to at summer picnics, at the way I used to try to impress her with a poem I had written, the lines awkward, clumsy, but heartfelt. And when morning came, pale light filtering through curtained window, we held that letter, the photograph, the ribbon, and all that we had been, knowing that even if some things could never return, some days lost, some friendship broken, some futures never realized, what remained was real, was ours, was enough to give shape to forgiveness, to give shape to love renewed, to give shape to peace. We stayed in that cabin for several days, as though the world beyond its wooden walls had ceased to matter, as though the clock had paused to let us reclaim something we thought lost to time. And each morning I woke early, before dawn's light had fully spilled over the mountain ridge, to the sound of wind in the pines, the taste of damp air, the smell of coffee Emily brewed, strong and sweet, blur, ending with smoke from the wood stove, and I would sit on the porch, wrapped in a quilt she had made years ago, its patches faded but stitches holding tight, and I'd watch the first sliver of sun break behind the peaks, feeling something in me shift, a weight lifting, a part of the past settling, no longer sharp but softened, as though memory itself had been healed by her presence. Inside the cabin, her home, I saw what life had done to her and what she had built anyway. Her daughter, now grown, photograph on the mantel, hands busy with a book of poetry, quilts and embroidered pillows, lace curtains that fluttered even when the windows were closed. Jars of preserves on a shelf, peaches from summer, cherries, but also blackberry jam made from berries she foraged after storms, a tradition she said reminded her of childhood. The little brass clock by the window that ticked off seconds gently, a small sound that said time did move forward even when the heart felt stuck. We cooked together. Cornbread, butter melting over hot slices, eggs fried in bacon grease, garden tomatoes sliced thick with salt, herbs she grew in pots by the window, rosemary, thyme, basil, the scent rising through the cabin like a hymn, and in those shared meals, in hands brushing as I passed her the salt, in laughter at burnt edges of bread, in quiet smiles over well-worn dishes, I felt what had survived. The small intimacy of ordinary life, of gestures unspectacular yet sacred. One evening after supper, thunder rolled overhead, but this time I did not fear it. I sat close beside Emily by the fire, the glow painting her face gold, shadows dancing in the corners, and I reached for her hand, feeling how her skin now bore the fine lines of years. Yet though her body had changed in ways war and time demanded, her heart bore a softness that seemed undimmed. I asked her, in a voice both hopeful and afraid, "Do you still love me?" Then she paused as if the words carried every year we had lived apart, every letter lost, every fear that I had been forgotten. But after a heartbeat she said, "Always," but now in a different way. And those words, so simple, so tender, held a universe. Acceptance of what could be. Acceptance of what could no longer return, youth unscarred, dreams unbroken, mornings when the only danger was loss of daylight. And yet love remained, constant, changed, more patient now, shaped by absence and survival. We did not fall into false illusions. We did not speak of marriage, of building a future together as though nothing had shifted, because life had shifted. Her daughter's presence was a witness to that. The years she had raised her alone, the responsibilities she carried, the losses she incurred. She showed me pictures. Her daughter graduating high school, walking into a new home after marriage, holding hands with her husband in a churchyard. I saw friends of mine, war buddies in photographs with grey hair, some missing limbs, some with medals, some with scars hidden beneath collars. I showed her mine, my hands once sturdy, gnarled by years of work, my back bent slightly, my eyes lined. We both laughed sometimes softly at the difference between the boy I was and the man I became, at the way we once believed innocence would return, not knowing that life's return is always measured in what we accept, not in what we reclaim. Alongside the laughter there were tears, tears for what we lost, the letters that never made it, the seasons she waited through alone, the dreams I carried unspoken, tears for the promises we made under a Carolina moon that could not bear witness to all that separated us. There was regret too, mine for not writing more, for not risking that last letter sooner, hers for nights spent listening for footsteps on gravel, praying that somehow I would appear, though she knew deep inside what silence meant. We held those regrets together, placed them gently on a shelf like fragile glass, acknowledging the cracks, not trying to glue them, but letting the light through. And yet, beneath all that could not return, there remained something real, something steady, gratitude. Gratitude that she waited, even when waiting must have felt like punishment. Gratitude that I found her, that she did not drive me away when I showed up soaked by rain, words forgotten at my lips, gratitude for every small moment, the laughter, the shared coffee, the slide of her hand across mine, the moment the sun broke behind mountain ridges, the smell of her garden after rain, the ribbon, faded but alive, resting in my jacket. Those moments prove that love is not always loud, not always dramatic, not always what we expect, but love endures. By the final morning, when I had to leave, packing my gear in the mist-grey dawn, pulling on my boots, folding the quilt she had draped over me, I carried in my duffel not just clothes or food, but all that I had reclaimed: forgiveness, memory, understanding, release. She handed me the ribbon once more, pressed her hands into mine, said, "Take this, so you carry something real of what we were." And as I placed it carefully in my breast pocket, alongside the folded, unsent letter, I realized something. The part of what remained between us could feed the rest of my life, though it could never heal all the wounds, never return all the years, never reweave all the dreams we once shared. I drove away that morning over a road slick with dew, the mountain air crisp, sun breaking through pine limbs, the ribbon warm in my pocket, the letter heavy in my heart, but no longer painful. I did not look back more than once, because looking back too long is how regrets root themselves in your soul. And though I knew I would never relive the past, never walk those young steps again beneath moonlight, or pick peaches in summer, or dance at summer fairs with innocence fresh, I also knew I carried something more precious: clarity, acceptance, peace. Because some things can never return. The ideal of youth, untouched by war, the perfect future we imagined, the ease of days when love meant simply being near, before distance, before fear. But what still existed between us: memory, forgiveness, gratitude, love transformed rather than lost, was enough. Enough to light my way forward, enough to let me ride on without being broken by what time had taken. If this story has stayed with you this far, if you felt what I felt while living and writing it, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps us keep telling these stories that speak to the quiet corners of the heart. Now, stay close, because what comes next will bring it all full circle.